Hello, and welcome to my talk. I'm Courtney, and today I will be talking to you about how you can level up your playtests. Specifically, I will be discussing some common pitfalls or mistakes that are easy to make when running playtests, and importantly, I'll also tell you how you can avoid them and what you can do instead. All right, so let's jump in. Now, this talk will have 3 parts. First, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Then I'll talk about playtest, what it is and how you can use it. And finally, I'll jump into those pitfalls and tips to avoid them. So a little bit about myself. I have a background in psychology. And after that, I worked as a game designer and user researcher for an immersive escape game company in Toronto. And then about 4.5 years ago, I joined Ubisoft Toronto. And there I've had the opportunity to run playtest for a variety of AAA games. Though primarily, I did work on the single-player campaign and DLC for Watch Dogs Legion. Now, Ubisoft Toronto was established in 2010 and has around 850 team members. And since its inception, it has contributed to the following titles. And most recently, Far Cry 6, which is coming out very soon. All right, now on this slide, you'll see a couple pictures. This is our very own user research lab at the studio. There's a smaller room with a comfy couch, and that's actually a 2-way mirror so we can observe participants. These are primarily for one-on-one think aloud sessions. And in the other photo, you will see a much larger lab where we have many players come all at the same time to play the game and give us some feedback. Okay, so now I will talk about playtest. So, what is playtest? Playtest is games user research in action. So games user research is a discipline just like programming, animation, or QC. But the goal of games user research is to work with designers to improve the game over time and create the best possible gaming experience. And one of the main tools we use to do that is playtest. So that's where we'll have real users or players, gamers, come in to play the game and give us feedback. And that allows us to evaluate the design and experience in a user-oriented way. Now, by doing this, we are able to validate the design because design is a hypothesis and user testing is a way to test that hypothesis. So by that, I mean, we test out if the players actually interact with the game as expected and also check if they like it. So another thing that playtests are good at, so aside from just identifying issues, playtests are actually good at generating a deep understanding of the problems that players face. And it's that getting enough detail and understanding about the problems that help the design team figure out how best to solve those issues. So how can you use playtests? Well, there are a number of ways. For example, you might take an exploratory approach and just generate some understanding about how your players play the game. For instance, what do they do or where do they go? You may also use playtests to validate design intentions. So maybe you have a new feature and you want to test out if players understand it and use it as intended. You can also track the impact of design changes by playtesting before and after a change has been made, and then checking to see how that influenced the experience. You can determine a game's strengths and weaknesses, so find out which aspects of your game are contributing to the overall enjoyment and which are actually detracting from it. You can use playtests to get specific information that designers need or answer certain questions that they have to help them make their decisions. And you can also use playtests to identify all sorts of issues from usability to accessibility, difficulty balancing, or just features that players dislike or find frustrating. And when can you use playtests? The answer is throughout development, the whole time. You should be testing early and testing often. So you can test out just concepts in the very beginning, and then when you have enough going to make a paper prototype, you can use that to test. So you can really generate valuable insights without having high fidelity prototypes. But eventually you would use a functional prototype and then right all the way up until your beta builds. And ideally, you could have a development cycle that looks something like this, where feedback from each playtest is integrated into the design, and then it's integrated into the game, and then you playtest again. So you get this nice cycle where you're iterating over and over, and you integrating that feedback from playtest. So iteration is key. Now, user research is interested in understanding and measuring the human experience, and you can break that experience down into three main parts: what people do, what people feel, and what people think. Now, in the context of games, that might look like, in terms of what they think, understanding where to go, or remembering the controls. In terms of what players do, that could mean throwing a grenade or killing 16 enemies during a mission. And in terms of how players feel, that could mean having fun or being frustrated with the difficulty. Importantly, these three factors of the human experience influence each other. Okay, so to give you an example, if a player thinks that pressing A will jump, but in reality that's actually going to make the character take cover, that's going to have an impact on what they do. Because if they were trying to run away from an enemy and jump over a fence, they'll press A, but instead of jumping over a fence, they'll take cover, which will result in them getting killed. And this will have an impact on how they feel, because they weren't expecting that, because they were expecting to jump, and so they were frustrated, feeling like that death was unfair. And as a result, they dislike the control mapping. So different methodologies that you can use are better at capturing different types of data. So as you can see here, if you want to know what players think, you could ask them a question in a survey, or you could use a think aloud method, which is a technique where you have players vocalize all the thoughts that they're having while they play, and you may or may not probe them with questions throughout. If you want to know what players are doing, you could simply observe them, or use telemetry to get some tracking data to see what they're doing. If you want to know how players feel, you could use surveys once again to ask them, or potentially use biometric data like a heart sensor or a skin conductance sensor. A good way to think about this is an iceberg. So it's very easy to see what's going on the surface, that being what players are doing in the game, but it's really hard to tell what they're thinking and what they're feeling, because that's hidden underneath, and you're going to need to apply some user research methods in order to dig deep and find out what's going on underneath. All right, so now it's time to get into those pitfalls and give you some tips so you can avoid them. So first up is not defining clear, specific goals. So it can be really easy to overlook the benefits of determining exactly what you want to learn from each playtest. And it can be tempting to want to skip this step to save time, but not doing so will really limit the value of your playtests. So without taking the time in advance to plan what you want to focus on and what questions you want answered, you'll likely find at the end of a playtest you have this big long list of issues, but you don't really understand them that well. And you'll probably find that you have some gaps in your knowledge and you're missing some key information. And that's because you'll likely have missed out on opportunities to collect feedback about key topics or at key moments. So for example, if you wanted to learn about the clarity of a mechanic, ideally in advance, you would have made a plan to observe that participant while they play the tutorial and interview them right after so you can assess their understanding. However, if you didn't have that plan in advance, you might not ask those questions at all, or you may have waited too long and missed that window of opportunity, so that when the participant is answering your questions, they actually don't really remember what happened and don't remember what they were thinking or if they noticed certain things. And something else that can happen is that some issues will actually be quite difficult to understand and investigate later on. So for example, you might find at the end of a playtest that a few participants never engaged at all with this new important feature. And if you didn't have a plan in advance to ask about that new important feature, you might not understand why, because there are a number of explanations for that. Perhaps they didn't find it interesting, or there was a clarity issue and they actually weren't even aware that that feature existed, or they were maybe just having so much fun doing what they were doing they didn't want to stop. So Defining your goals and planning in advance is going to make sure that you get the questions that are the most important to you fully answered and help you get all the key information you need from participants while you have them there. And lastly, analyzing data and synthesizing everything into some findings for your team is hard to do quickly if you don't have a clear list of questions that you're trying to answer. Okay, so what to do instead? So define your goals and then break down each of those goals into smaller, specific research questions. So let's take an example. Say one of my test goals is to find out, do players enjoy combat in the game? So we're going to take that and break it down into smaller research questions. So we don't just want to ask players about what they think about the combat system. We want to ask what they think about the enemies, and what about the weapons and the combat difficulty. See where I'm going? So basically, if you are making research questions, if you're interested in appreciation, that is whether players like something or not, you're going to want to break that feature down into the smaller components of that feature, like we did with combat. And if you're interested in usability, you're going to want to break down, you're going to do a similar thing, but instead of breaking down a feature, you're going to break down the user experience. So think about each small step the player has to go through, everything they have to notice, everything they have to understand, and everything they have to do. And then have a research question for each of those parts of the experience. Okay, so after you have your goals and your research questions, you'll then want to define how you will answer each of those research questions and assign a method, like a survey or observation or an interview. And then when you have all that, you will figure out when you're going to answer each of these questions and basically organize your test and create a schedule from beginning to end. Not piloting your process. So by piloting your process, what I mean is practicing your playtest flow entirely from beginning to end. So it can be tempting to want to skip running a practice session to save some time. But not practicing your playtest will mean you're going to risk running into some problematic issues that you could have otherwise prevented, such as disorganized and chaotic playtests, or running out of time and not getting to some important questions you had at the end, or cramming too much in and finding that you exhausted your participants. And if they're exhausted, the quality of their feedback is going to degrade. You might forget things or find there's mistakes or typos. You might have some unexpected technical issues. You might find your instructions were actually unclear. So then you have players that aren't going to be doing what you need them to do or playing what you need them to play. You might find similarly that your survey questions were unclear, which means you're not going to get the exact feedback that you needed. Overall, the flow might not make so much sense, so the order in which you had players play certain things or do some tasks. And the tasks might not work if perhaps the players didn't expect, or if the players didn't behave how you expected them to. So, what to do instead? You guessed it, practice your whole playtest session, the whole process from beginning to end. This is going to prevent all the time and energy that you spent organizing the playtest and then having it not work out when the real participants are there. So it'll just ensure that it runs smoothly and that you get the feedback that you need. So grab a colleague, a friend, a family member, anybody, and ask them to participate in a practice session for you. Now, the less familiar they are with the game, the better. Ideally, it's not someone who works closely on the game. However, even if that's the case, you should still do it because it's still very valuable. Then you'll instruct them to act like a real participant. Fully pretend they're a participant in your study. That means they should follow instructions, ask questions if things aren't clear, play the game and play naturally, and then give you feedback and fill out your surveys and answer your questions. So this is going to help you see if there's any issues with your flow and give you a chance to tweak those and improve it so that everything works out when it's time for the real play test. Not profiling participants. So every game is going to have a target player profile. That is a profile of the players that fall into their target market or their target audience. So by profiling, what I mean is checking to see if a player falls into your target profile or not. So if playtest participants are not profiled, then it's going to be unclear which of your feedback is coming from the target profile and which of the feedback is not. And that can be dangerous because collecting and integrating feedback that's coming from outside of your target profile can actually lead the game and or features in the wrong direction. So what you want to do instead is make sure you have a clearly defined target profile. You may want to consider what game genres players are fans of, or what consoles they own or are at least familiar with, and maybe also some specific games that they've played, such as games similar to yours or competitors. And if possible, ideally, you should screen participants in advance and only invite those who match your target profile to come participate in your playtest. But that's not always possible. You might be at some sort of event, like an industry event where everyone who is coming by is going to be playtesting your game. So in that scenario, it's a good idea to at least ask them a few questions to try to gauge how close of a match they are to your target profile. And having this profile status information later on is going to be helpful because it might help you explain your findings. And it may even help you detangle if an issue that came up was truly an issue with the game, or perhaps the real issue was that they didn't match your profile. So feedback coming from players outside your target profile should be used with caution, and you should consider excluding it if the nature of the feedback seems relevant to how they don't match your profile. So here's a quick example to show you how different your data can look if you do or do not profile your participants. So in the first example, we have done no profiling at all. And we can see after the playtest that an alarming 45% of players disliked the combat. And the number one complaint about combat was the weapon aiming. But there was also an issue with some being frustrated that weapons had low damage. Now, if we take that same group of participants and same feedback, but we implemented some profiling, we can see that the data tells a little bit of a different story. First of all, the issue with players disliking combat is thankfully not quite as severe. So it's only actually at 25% in our target profile. And it turns out that weapon aiming was really not an issue for most of our participants. And actually, the number one complaint related to combat was that low weapon damage. And if we look at those who didn't match the profile, that's where we see the majority of players who had problems with the weapon aiming. And in their profile, it actually turns out that they lacked experience with shooters using gamepads, and that's what we used in our playtest. So these participants who didn't match our profile were typically play shooters with a mouse and keyboard. So that explains why they weren't comfortable at all using the weapon aiming on a gamepad, because they weren't used to it. And they didn't have any issues with the weapon damage. So here's an example of how the issue can look different in terms of severity, but also what players are complaining about. And depending on whether or not you profile, the solution that the team would have arrived at could be entirely different. Trying to keep it all in your head. So juggling all of the tasks that need to be done during a playtest can be overwhelming. Juggling the note-taking, the moderation, as well as the other duties, that is going to probably lead to some missed observations and probably also some time wasted. Also, after running multiple sessions, it can be easy to forget details or start mixing up which observation belonged to which player or playtest session. Lastly, not recording playtests risks that you're going to miss out on important observations that you originally missed during the playtest. So this is going to limit your analysis later on because, it's impossible to observe everything going on during the playtest and make note of it. So it's really handy to have those recordings there so you can go back and take a second look, especially because it's not always clear what you're looking for in advance. So what to do instead? Try to record your sessions. If you can, try to capture the gameplay, both the visual and audio, everything the participant is saying, and a view of the participant, ideally one that captures both their facial expressions and their body language. And if possible, designate separate team members to do the note-taking and to do the moderation and interviewing of participants. Try to debrief with your team about the observations and insights you had from a playtest session immediately after that playtest session ends, while it's still fresh in your mind. And take notes in an organized way. So either by organizing them by feature or by theme, or perhaps use a tool that allows you to tag things and sort later on. And this will allow you to find things later and not have to remember everything. Always taking feedback at face value. So player feedback should not always be taken at face value. While getting feedback directly from players is incredibly helpful, it does have its limitations. So not everything is easy for players to articulate, and it can be difficult for them to know what they want or what they need or what the best solution is to a problem. After all, they're experts in what they think and feel, not necessarily game design. Now, players are human and they're going to forget things, and increasingly so as time goes on. So be careful how long you wait before you collect feedback about certain experiences. Because keep in mind that participants, after a certain time, they may forget things, their memory might be inaccurate, or they may even accidentally or subconsciously rationalize what happened just to try and give you an answer to your question to help you out. Okay, and people aren't actually that accurate when it comes to predicting their own behavior. Player feedback will be impacted by any clarity issues they experience. So a player might not understand something, but they might not be aware that they don't understand that thing. So keep that in mind, because that understanding or lack of is going to influence what feedback they give you. And lastly, players don't know what they don't know. So, what to do instead? Try not to just listen to players, but really try to understand them. Instead of asking them what they want, try to dig deep so that you get a real sense of what their goals and motivations were, as well as what problems they faced and what frustrations they had. Try to collect and use multiple data sources. This is going to help you really see the full picture of what's going on, and it'll help you to triangulate issues. Because sometimes participants say the problem is one thing, when in reality, it's actually something different. For example, if a player had an issue with the combat and they say that, the enemy tactics were actually not that good. The enemies didn't seem intelligent at all, and that ruined combat for me. You could take that at face value, but ideally, instead, you have multiple data sources. And so let's say you also had the recordings of the play test. You could go back and watch them fight against the enemies. And you might notice that there's actually just a bug that's happening. So the enemy AI is really just bugging out, and that was really the cause of the issue, rather than the issue that the participant said. Try to obtain, when you're getting these multiple data sources, try to have an attitudinal data source as well as a behavioral data source. So that means for attitudinal, surveys or interviews, so you can get at what players think and or feel, and as well as behavioral data, so you can get at what they did and what they actually played in the game, coming from observations or telemetry. If possible, if you're collecting feedback about something in the game, try to also evaluate the understanding and the clarity of that thing that you're getting feedback on. Because, as we covered, any clarity issues is going to impact their feedback. Okay, so here's a quick example. Now, if we look at what the player is feeling, say we had a survey at the end of a playtest, and we can see that the player felt bored with the combat, and they actually disliked it because they found it repetitive. Now, if we take that at face value, issue seems simple enough, combat gets repetitive. Okay, but let's say we were smart and we had multiple data sources, and we actually had the tracking to check what the player did in the game and who they fought. And we can see that the player actually never left the starting region of the map. So they actually didn't go outside a certain area and where there's more enemies and more weapons to be discovered. So they ended up playing with the starting pistol and they only encountered 2 enemy types. So this additional information from a different data source, it kind of explains why the player would feel that way about combat. Okay, and let's say we had yet another data source that could tell us what the player was thinking, and we were able to verify that the player actually wasn't even aware that there were other regions of the map and that they never discovered the pathway out of that first starting region. So this is an example of having multiple data sources and triangulating an issue by getting the full picture of what's going on. So at the start, it looked like the issue was about combat repetitiveness, but after all that work, we realized that the real issue was really about the discoverability of regions in the map. Okay, now to continue on. When you're asking participants questions, try to stick to asking about the present or the recent past and avoid asking about the future or hypotheticals. Also, instead of asking players why they ran into some issues, you should ask them a bunch of questions about their experience so that you can determine the why and figure out why they ran into those issues. Collecting biased feedback. So one scenario that's going to bias your feedback is if players don't feel comfortable, because if they don't feel comfortable, they're not going to play the game naturally. They also might not share honest feedback, or they may even withhold it. For example, they might feel too awkward to share negative opinions about the game. Moderators can also bias players depending on how they speak and behave, as well as their demeanor, how much information they provide, and how they word questions. Lastly, revealing the goals of your playtest or what it is you're hoping to learn, it can also skew player behavior and their feedback. So they could, letting them know what you want to know and what you want to find out can influence how they play the game through cognitive priming. So that's when simply knowing that information will alter how they behave, and they might pay attention to certain things or focus on certain things that they otherwise would not have. And that could be happening at an unconscious level or a subconscious level. And also it could be happening at a conscious level where the player knows that you're interested in something, so they try to be helpful by focusing on that and then talking about it when you ask for feedback. However, that is biased, and so we want to prevent that from happening. Okay, so what to do instead? Help your players to feel comfortable. Try to build a rapport. Okay, introduce yourself, get to know them a little bit, have some small talk, try to make them feel at ease. And explain that negative feedback is welcome and very helpful for you. Try to remove any feelings of pressure by explaining that there's no right or wrong way to play and that no one is judging them. Also, let them know they can stop at any time, just to remove any sense of pressure. And also try to favor individual feedback over focus groups, because that can introduce some social dynamics which will skew your data. For example, focus groups can lead to groupthink, where once one opinion is expressed, the rest of the group tends to be skewed towards agreeing with that opinion. And those who don't share that opinion are less likely to voice their own opinions. Also, try to limit the number of observers in the room, because I think we would all agree that if there were a bunch of people watching us, it would start to make us feel self-conscious. And so that's going to prevent them from talking freely and playing the game naturally. Also, set some rules for any of the observers in the room. You don't want them jumping in and them asking questions or having them interrupt your session. So also, you want to maintain a welcome but neutral demeanor. And you want to keep this demeanor consistent throughout. So this is pertaining to specifically when you're asking about the game and anytime you're collecting feedback. That's when you want to be neutral. Because you don't want to sway them or influence them in any way, whether that's positively or negatively. So for example, if I was interviewing a participant and for one answer they were giving, I started to nod my head all of a sudden, which I hadn't done before. And maybe I agree with them or say, oh, that's great. That's really great information. Something like that would positively reinforce what the participant is saying. So that would encourage them to say similar things or keep talking about that or bring it up more often. It could influence them in a whole host of ways. So you don't want to do that because that means they're talking about what they think you want them to talk about rather than what's actually important to them and their experience. Okay, and lastly, try to be vague about the goals of the playtest. As we said, that can have an influence. So it's okay to keep it broad and say, oh, we're interested in missions, rather than telling them what it is you want to know about missions. For example, if you're really interested in how clear the story is, keep that to yourself. Just say you're interested in testing out the missions. And that way you prevent biasing your data. Because if the participants knew you were interested in story clarity, they would probably pay more attention to the story while they play than they would have otherwise. And then your data is going to probably be skewed towards saying it was pretty clear because they were paying more attention to it than they naturally would have. And yeah, we can move on. So when interviewing players, try to use some techniques to minimize your influence. So when a player responds with a short, brief answer, try to not respond right away, go against your gut and resist that urge and try and lean into the awkward silence. This usually prompts participants to elaborate or clarify what they were talking about. So you can also respond to questions with questions. So for example, if a player says, oh, what does that icon mean? Or I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do here. You could simply ask, oh, can you tell me what you think that icon means? And then you're using their own language and you're not really introducing more information here. You're not revealing anything, but you're getting them to give you more feedback. Okay, and try not to put words in players' mouths. So you don't ever want to make a suggestion of how they feel or guess how they feel, like, oh, you sound confused, or I see, you're frustrated. You want to only have them let you know how they feel and what they think. You don't want to put words in their mouths. And try to use the player's language in that way. So if they call something that icon thing, you should call it that icon thing and not give them any more information than they already have. Okay, so you can also repeat what they say back to them in the format of a question by going up at the end, and that will also prompt an elaboration or a clarification without you influencing them. So, for example, they might grumble and go, "Ugh, that was difficult," and you could simply go, "Difficult?" And that's usually enough to have them start to explain why they said that. Okay, and when asking questions, try to avoid leading questions. So that's when it's clear that you want them to answer in a certain way. So it's either positively or negatively skewed. For example, if you asked, how much did you love the story? It's already skewed towards loving the story, to being positive. When what you should ask is, what did you think of the story? Because that's neutral. Also, avoid double-barreled questions. So that's when you're asking about two things in the one question. Like, what did you think about the plot and the characters? Because it's kind of like asking them to give you one answer when they might have two completely different opinions about those two different things. Also, avoid assumptive or loaded questions. So that's when you are making an assumption about what the player thinks or what they did when you're asking it. For example, how much did you enjoy using that equipment when taking a stealth approach? That assumes that they used the equipment. It also assumes that they took a stealth approach when they might not have. And also try to lean towards using open-ended questions, because that doesn't box players into choosing from predefined answers, so there will be less bias. And lastly, if you have more specific questions, try to ask those after your more broad questions. And any questions that will reveal, tip off the players what you are interested in learning and what your goals are, try to ask those later on in the session so that all the feedback you got before that point is not biased. Not focusing on the why. So if the why is not a focus before, during, and even after playtests, you're going to reveal issues but not understand the causes behind those issues. And that's problematic, because if you don't have a deep understanding of the different contributing factors that are leading to these issues, it's going to be difficult for the design team to action on that feedback and to fix the issues. And this isn't just true for issues. You also want to understand the why behind the positive aspects. Because if there were aspects of the game that the players really enjoyed and there was a design change that needs to be made, it may or may not be clear if that design change might have a negative impact on the enjoyment of another aspect. Sometimes it would be clear if they're completely unrelated, but sometimes it's not. Okay, so what to do instead? So for every observation you make, whether that's negative or positive, try to include as much information about the contributing causes and the context as possible. So for example, certain issues might only happen in certain contexts, like maybe there's an issue with the combat that only occurs when fighting a large group of enemies, but isn't really present if you're only fighting a few. And when players don't provide in-depth answers, often they will begin by answering questions with a short, brief answer. Make sure you probe with follow-up questions and prompt them to elaborate and really give you some details. Prepare a list of generic follow-up questions, which you can use pretty much at any time. So I'll show you a few examples. Here you go. So why do you think that is? Can you tell me more about that? Any other thoughts about that? What makes you say that? And can you tell me what you mean by that? So these are good questions to just have in your back pocket that you can pull out at any time to get the player to keep talking. Okay, now, if players give you suggestions, probe to try and find out why they gave that suggestion, because it's likely that there was a perceived problem that this suggestion is actually trying to fix. So you want to go about finding out what made them give that suggestion. Okay, and plan your playtests in a way that will actually enable you to uncover the why. So that goes back to the early slide I showed about different methodologies being good at getting different types of data. So when you're planning your playtest, make sure you're going to capture the different data sources and you're going to actually be able to figure out the why behind the issues at the end of the day. So you want to do this by collecting multiple data sources, using the right methodologies to help you answer why, and plan interventions at key times, whether that's getting them to do a task, asking certain questions, anything like that. And that was the last pitfall. So thank you so much for taking the time to watch this presentation. I do hope that it was helpful and that you learned some tips that you can take with you and apply to your playtests. Bye.